So welcome everyone to the last meeting of 2022. And we're ending off with a brilliant seminar by Professor Zachary Wright. Thank you so much for being with us, Prof. Wright. And I now have the honor of introducing him to you. Zachary Wright is a professor of history and religious studies in the liberal arts program and associate dean for faculty affairs at Northwestern University in Qatar. He received his PhD in African history from Northwestern University, his MA in Arabic Studies, Middle East history from the American University in Cairo, and his BA in history from Stanford University. His research focuses on Islamic intellectual history in North and West Africa from the 15th century to the present. His book publications include Realizing Islam, the Tijaniya in North Africa, and the 18th century Muslim world. Jihad of the Pen, the Sufi literature of West Africa, co-authored with Rudolf Ware and Amir Said, American University in Cairo Press 2018, Sur le voie de prophète, Sheikh Ahmed Tijani et la Tariqa Muhammadan, and Living Knowledges in West African Islam, the Sufi community of Ibrahim Niasse. He has also translated a number of West African Arabic texts into English, such as The Removal of Confusion, concerning the flood of the Saintly Seal by Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. His current research focuses on Islamic clerical independence in the Songhay Empire. Thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Bismillah. It's a great honor. Good morning to you all. Good afternoon, I guess, to any of us on the other side of the world like me. I'm joining you from Qatar, where we've been honored to host the Moroccan team, and the whole country is splashed in red, of course. And clearly, I got my flags outside of the house still. I'm very honored to be participating in this conversation, Penn State's African Studies Global Virtual Forum, and hosted by so many distinguished scholars. Right, so just to kind of pick up on the introduction, thank you very much for that, Chanel. I basically have three main focuses of my research. One is that the first one has been sort of Sufism in West Africa, 20th century, late 19th century and 20th century through decolonization. Secondly, has been Muslim reformist and revivalist networks centering around the Tariqa Muhammadiyya phenomenon in North Africa, but these were networks, of course, that spanned into West Africa and all the way to India. And certainly in the Jihads also. And then lastly is this sort of newer research in the medieval Songhay Empire, which looks at clerical, as I said, clerical independence and relationships of Muslim scholars to sultans, and doing some work on some of the earliest manuscripts discovered from Timbuktu. So that's been really interesting. My talk today is Muhammadan Sufism in West Africa, and maybe I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Let me see. Okay. Share. And then I will have to play from start. Okay, can you see that? Everybody can see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And you're still seeing the PowerPoint? Or are you seeing my notes? Okay. Right. So, well, I better make sure. So, okay. Okay. So this talk on Muhammadan Sufism in West Africa, which I've slightly adjusted here, continuities and developments from the Songhay Empire to the present, examines Muslim religiosity in West Africa from the perspective of intellectual history, focusing on the practice and ideology of Sufism. As many scholars have already recognized, Sufism's gloss as quote-unquote Islamic mysticism, drawing as it does on a European paradigm of the alleged irreconcilability between personal mystical experience and official church doctrine, does little to comprehend the centrality of Sufi practices and institutions in the pre-modern Muslim world. In the context of colonial modernity in Muslim societies, Sufism has been read even less accurately as occultism, saint worship, maraboutism, or even peasant superstition. The fact that West Africa remains perhaps the only region in the Muslim world today where Sufism is still constitutive of Islamic identity for the majority of Muslim inhabitants means that colonial racialism, defined by the notion of an Islam noir or Negro Islam, continues to subtly inform our understanding of West African Sufism. For more than a century now, academics have rushed to translate the works of so-called white Sufis, Persians, Arabs, and to reflect on their humanist and metaphysical insights. So-called Black Sufism has been primarily understood through the lens of social, economic, or political instrumentalism. Participation in jihad, for example, the foundation of rebellious communities, the organization of cash crop farming, the engagement with various forms of patronage politics. This talk attempts to speak to the more recent reframing of West African Sufism from the perspective of Islamic intellectual history and based on ongoing dialogue with the region's robust scholarly legacy. Internal reading of Sufism in West Africa is complicated by an apparent historical anomaly. Even if Sufism is popular in the region today, Sufi orders were apparently almost unknown in West Africa prior to the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Scholarly centers like Timbuktu in the 15th and 16th centuries were known primarily for their study of Islamic law. And there is no reference to any particular Sufi order in either of the two Songhay chronicles, the Tariq al-Sudan or the recently renamed Tariq ibn Mukhtar, or in the intellectual autobiographies of prominent scholars such as Ahmed Baba, who died in 1627. This was a time when empires elsewhere in the Muslim world actively courted established Sufi orders, such as the Naqshbandiya and Chishtiya in the Mughal or Timurid India, the Khalwatiya or Mevlaviya in Naqshbandiya and the Ottoman Empire, the Shazaliya and Qadiriya in Mamluk Egypt or Marinid Morocco. To further complicate matters, various anti-Sufi extremist elements, such as Boko Haram in Nigeria, have attempted to appropriate the jihadist legacy of the Sokoto Caliphate, for example, obscuring the profound Sufi inclinations of earlier mujahideen, such as Sheikh Uthman Danfodio and El Hajj Umar Tal. But seen from inside what one might call the classical West African Islamic curriculum, African Muslims are still studying much of the same texts as their ancestors 500 or more years ago. This represents a remarkable self-perceived continuity, centering on affiliation to the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence, the Ash'ari school of atomistic theology, and what they might call orthodox, quote unquote, Muhammadan Sufism. This talk then focuses on this internal understanding of an enduring Muhammadan Sufism in West Africa, while being sensitive to the various ways in which this spiritual disposition has engaged with very different historical contexts. So I just have a few slides that I would sort of run through that try to work out these three main periods. And I'll first start with some of the continuities. What do we mean by Muhammadan Sufism? Now, there's a couple of ways of understanding this. One is to say that Muhammadan Sufism is a translation of the Tariqa Muhammadiyya. Of course, the Tariqa Muhammadiyya, there's much more literature that sort of talks about this phenomenon, mostly centering in the late 18th century and the ways in which the Khalwatiyya and the Tijaniyya and others invoke this phenomenon. But I think more generally, the idea of a Muhammadan Sufism means essentially that anything that is not following the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is outside of Orthodox Sufism. And so it's a recognition then that Sufism is synonymous or the essence of the Sharia or the Islamic law. So what do we mean more generally? I think we can sort of generally extrapolate what Muhammadan Sufism means in the context of West Africa. And this is also a definition that I think is certainly resonates with the 18th century revivalist Sufi networks, such as the Tijaniyya. So first of all, the emphasis on the external Sunnah meaning following the behavioral ideal of the Prophet Muhammad. So that means, getting married, being involved in the world, the balance between tasawwuf and fiqh. Very famously then, Imam Malik, the founder of the Maliki school, is quoted in this regard to say that whoever practices, Islamic law without Sufism has corrupted himself. But whoever practices Sufism without Islamic law corrupts his religion, but who combines the two has proven true. And I think this was the sort of understanding in West Africa for many centuries now. In terms of practice, you see the proliferation then of various forms of Salat ala Nabi, prayer upon the Prophet, various forms of qasaid that center or the poetical tradition in Arabic, but also in other Ajami languages, that's really centers upon the praise poetry for the Prophet. We also see some of the earliest textual references in West Africa down to the present. There's a widespread report of this ru'yat al-Nabi, the vision of the Prophet, seeing the Prophet either in dream or in a waking state. And over time, then a tendency to sort of think about the tariqa or the path that's connected directly to the Prophet as being better than any other. And this is most famously true with the Tijaniya, but it's also true with other Sufi orders right around the same time. So even within this context, then, we certainly see a remarkable continuity. So if we're thinking, there's various ways, of course, to define Sufism. If we're talking about, the purification of the self, we're talking about affiliation to a sheikh, we're talking about the experience of the knowledge of God. One way is that lots of literature picks up on is this idea of the karamat, the saintly miracles. And interesting enough, we find this very intriguing similarity between an account related from the 15th century and an account related in the 20th century. Sheikh Yahya Tadalisi was one of the foundational saints of Timbuktu. And his grave is still known and visited to this day. And it's said that his servant girls once cooked a fresh fish from morning to evening, but the fire had no effect on it. Hearing them express their astonishment, he said to them, this morning, when I went out for the early morning worship, my foot brushed against something damp in the entrance hall. Perhaps it was that fish. Whatever my body touches cannot be burnt by fire. Very similar story is related about Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, the Tijani Sheikh of Senegal, and a man who came to pray behind him after he had purchased some meat in the market, found that he was unable to cook the meat when he returned home. And Sheikh Ibrahim then said, everything that is behind me in the congregational prayer is immune against the fire. So this is the sort of an idea then that there's this sort of continuity of an understanding of walaya, right? Of an understanding of friendship with God and what that means for the human condition, that this can transform the human condition to be so that this person has a sort of or transmits a certain grace to the rest of the community. So even though I said, of course, there are no Sufi orders in Timbuktu during the time of Yahya Tadalisi, we certainly find ideas of walaya that are there from the beginning and that represent a remarkable continuity through the 20th century. And so perhaps one way to understand this is to think that, well, perhaps there are no external Sufi orders in Timbuktu in the 15th century because they have their own traditions of walaya, their own traditions of sainthood, that they don't find themselves in need of affiliating themselves to Sufi orders that originated elsewhere. So I think there are three, basic stages of Sufism in West Africa, looking at this historically. And I've sort of divided them by sort of thinking about different types of emphases that are within the Sufi tradition more largely. One, a sort of emphasis on spiritual of self-purification, one, an emphasis on walking the path to God, and another on an emphasis, so tazkiyat, tariqa, and tarbiyah. And the lastly, a sort of emphasis on this training of the self in order to understand the knowledge of God, the direct experiential knowledge of God, or in Arabic, ma'rifatullah. And so I think that at different, even if the tradition, or even if the scholarly tradition in West Africa recognizes or thinks about these remarkable continuities, I think we can still sort of recognize ways in which different aspects of this Muhammadan Sufism were emphasized at different times to meet different historical contexts. So in the age of empires, and here I'm really talking about Mali and Songhay, that is roughly from, say, 1300s to 1591, when the Moroccans conquered Songhay. We can sort of see that there's an emphasis then on the idea that there's certainly these independent saintly lineages. They sometimes dramatically cultivate their independence from the state, and that state may be defined, they may be Muslim rulers over that state, but nonetheless they have ideas then that these kind of holy cities should be independent, and in many cases the king cannot enter without permission from the imam these scholarly cities, even if they're under his own, within the purviews of his own empire. We also recognize a dispersal of various scholarly lineages. I've written about this elsewhere, and sort of recognizing that with the conversion of the ancient kingdom of Ghana to Islam sometime in the 11th century, and then the subsequent rise of Mali, many of the kind of core scholarly families, such as the Drame, the Toure, the Cisse, and probably the Kayamage Cisse, the king of Ghana, was of the Cisse lineage, as was Al-Hajj Salim Saware. So they share a sort of lineage. And Al-Hajj Salim Saware is, of course, the founder of the Jihads lineage that took Islam way into Nigeria and other places. These scholarly lineages then from the time of Ghana, who may have had sort of noble status before, seem to have converted their noble status into a scholarly currency, if you will, and to sort of as a way of saying that they were not going to contest the rise of the Malayan Empire. But as a result, I think you see these sort of, from this early time, you start to see the dispersal of some of these core and some of the earliest Muslim scholarly lineages, such as the Jihads. But by and large, I think this this time is sort of characterized by an engagement with Songhay politics, but in the later Mali period also, but also a sort of demonstrated independence, and that's a sort of scholarly critique. And I think this is very similar to the ways in which Muslim scholars elsewhere in the time of medieval Muslim empire sort of thought about trying to influence politics in a positive way, but nonetheless preserving their independence, not only sort of intellectually, but also institutionally. So in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world, this was often done through scholarly control over the awqaf, or the system of charitable endowments, which were often, the schools, the mosques, the hospitals, etc. In West Africa, these were often done through agrarian independent land grants. So scholars then had their own agrarian communities from which they could speak truth to power. Now, after the collapse of Songhay, essentially this starts to coincide there's sort of an ARMA regime that's put in place, but by the end of the 17th century, the transatlantic slave trade really starts to affect internal politics. And so whatever was the critique of the political establishment during the time of the Songhay Empire gets sharpened by the end of the 17th century, when kings and political elites start to pillage their own populations and often start to sell people into slavery in order to get access to firearms, in order to augment their political power. And so what happens then is that this previously independent agrarian-based scholarly communities start to find that their de facto agreement with the political elites has been violated, right? They find that they are being attacked. And all of the jihads that emerge in West Africa from the late 1600s through the 1900s, their own internal narrative always posit the start of that jihad to an act of enslavement against their community. And so that could be a woman from their community that was sold into slavery. It could be, but most importantly, it's usually one of their hufaz, one of their walking Qurans, somebody who had memorized the Quran. And this was intolerable for a Muslim community to have such valued members be subjected to this humiliation. And so there's a series of jihads then that really is and this is really an age of revolutions. And it so happens then at this time, certainly by the end of the 18th century, we find Sufi orders coming to define community organization in a much more systematic way, right? But really what's going on here is the reconstitution in defense of independent clerical settlements, but with the banner of Sufism much more readily apparent. And so this is why we start to see Sufi orders really starting to proliferate, mostly the Qadiriyya, Tijaniyya, sometimes the Shazaliya also, from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Sufi orders then, after having established independent clerical settlements, basically what happens at the end of the age of jihads in the 1850s to the 1890s or so is that they start to meet up with colonial occupation. And so they witness a variety of defeats, largely based upon colonial alliance with the political establishment, the kind of ancien regime, non-Muslim elites as well as Muslim elites. And these forces combine to defeat the sort of Sufi-led jihad movements. It should be pointed out here that this is actually a global phenomenon and that there are a series of Sufi-led jihads all over the Muslim world in resistance of colonial occupation during this time. And in fact, probably Sufis are the only ones to resist colonial occupation in the Muslim world in this fashion. But what happens then is that with the defeat of these jihadist states, the colonial alliance with the old political elites doesn't work out the way that the colonial regimes think it will, because these political elites have already been they've already had their legitimacy contested. So what happens, at least in the Senegambian region and other regions besides, is that when these Marabouts give up the jihad and reconstitute independent clerical settlements, these settlements become flooded with all sorts of people. It should be mentioned then that one of the appeals of the Tariqa or the Sufi affiliation during the time of revolutions and the collapse of the Ancien regime was that the Tariqa was an identity that could appeal outside of caste and lineage and ethnic divisions that had formerly, in many cases, characterized the way in which political settlements happened. So this was a new vision then of constituting a political order that remained relevant even after colonial occupation, and in fact, perhaps was augmented by colonial occupation. So when colonial powers realized too late, to their chagrin, that in fact, colonial occupation has actually encouraged the spread of Islam, right? And they're wondering what happened. It's because they didn't really realize that they were sort of there was a process already going on for the last couple of hundred years that thought about the spread of Islam outside of the previously imposed caste structure within West Africa. And so what was going on then was a revolution after the collapse of the Songhay Empire that was really sort of completed, even though completed on the eve of colonial conquest, even if these jihad-led states, except for in some rare cases like the Sokoto Caliphate, were not able to maintain themselves through colonial occupation. They were still then able to constitute communities and spread and teach Islam under the colonial order. And so there's a legacy then, even if, you know, the external literature sort of thinks about the ways in which Marabouts reached an accommodation with colonial occupation, the self-perception of these communities is that they were the legacy of resistance to colonial occupation. So one of the things that you can do if you look at the internal literature of this community is that you find out from the very constitution of these communities, even while their leaders were having to give lip service or, you know, external oaths of allegiance to the French or British regime, you find that in the Arabic letters and elsewhere that there's a very lively discourse of cursing colonial powers, of praying against them. And, you know, over time, then, as this emerges into the late colonial and decolonial period post-World War II, we find Sufi Muslims from West Africa engaging in very, very broad anti-colonial solidarities, and in fact, perhaps articulating an alternative modernity. The end story here is then, from a West African perspective, contrary to what modernization theory teaches us, that kind of these religious identities and the old superstitions of the past would be gradually truncated by modernization. In fact, Sufism has revived itself and is very much, you know, engaged with articulating a vision of modernity. So I wanted to give you some evidence of some of the things that that's a kind of the broad tripartite division of history that I've talked about in West Africa, and just give you some of the evidence for that. One is to kind of emphasize the point that Sufis and people that even if they did not have a Sufi kind of tariqa, an affiliation to an external Sufi order, Sufis or Muslim scholars in Timbuktu and in the Songhay Empire, at least from the late 14th and early 15th century, had very, very pronounced articulations of walaya, of sainthood, that would match anywhere else in the Muslim world at the time. So these are just some examples. Muhammad al-Qabari is the author of the text Bustan al-Fuad wal-Manafi' that I've written about elsewhere. He probably dies in around 1450 or somewhere around in there. And it's said that he attained the very pinnacle of scholarship and righteousness. He was the locus of many extraordinary manifestations of divine grace. And what's interesting, of course, is that he's eulogized by Yahya Tadalisi, his student, in this poem. I wonder if after him there will be one who makes things clear, O Arabs, is there any champion after him? But here we certainly probably mean Arabic speakers. Muhammad al-Qabari is from a town to the south of Timbuktu. He is Soninke. He's definitely Black African, if we wanted to kind of racialize him in modern terms. And I just say this because a previous generation of literature has sort of talked about, the Akit lineage in particular as being a sort of Berber Sanhaja lineage that produced people like Ahmed Baba. And there's a sort of way of reading Islamic scholarship into Timbuktu as if it was the purview of these so-called white Berbers rather than Black Soninke or Mande scholars. And this kind of proves then that this is a ridiculous assumption, and that the foundational scholar of Timbuktu, the one who really taught the Akit lineage and the so-called Berber lineages after him, was definitely a so-called Black African. Yahya Tadalisi is similarly praised as the Qutb of his time, meaning he's the sort of axial saint. There's no saint in the world in his time that's of a higher spiritual rank than this scholar of Timbuktu, right? And I don't think there's any other way to sort of substantiate the idea that Sufism was alive and well in Timbuktu, even without any of the external Sufi orders. We also find this idea then that the saints of Timbuktu were having visions of the Prophet. So they said, and I've written elsewhere that in fact the Tariqa Muhammadiyya phenomenon, as we know it more historically, that arrives in the, that really proliferates in the 18th century, was in fact prefigured or preempted in West Africa. And so that many of the constituent elements then we're seeing proliferating in Timbuktu from the 15th century. And so you see then the juxtaposition of this saint, seeing the Prophet, but then also being involved in the world, even if that means that he has to forsake some of the visionary encounters. Yeah, so if I'll just skip very quickly to another phenomenon, which actually was calling itself a tariqa, although it was an exception. This is from the Niger desert from the 16th century. And this was a group of people following a saint or affiliating themselves to a saint called Mahmud al-Baghdadi. Allegedly, he was originally from Baghdad and then settled in this region. But he, was said to have taught a version of a tariqa Muhammadiyya, right? Where he says it's a tariqa Mahmudiyya, could be after his name, but keep in mind that Mahmud is also a name for the Prophet Muhammad. So, and he's, saying, he's describing this Sufi order in very similar terms that, the Tijaniya or the Khalwatiya in the late 18th century, or the Idrisiya would define their path. They're saying it's the original path, the path that is connected directly to the Prophet Muhammad, and it balances law with, Sufi practice. And he's clearly saying that our, majlis al-dhikr, our circles of remembrance, in other words, our Sufi practice, are organized and made ready by the Prophet. So this was something that increasingly in the 18th century, Sufis elsewhere in the world were also making the same claim. Well, this is a claim that's made very earlier on in West Africa from the 16th century. And then if you look at the Kitab al-Ibris min Kalam Sayyidi Abdul Aziz, about Abdul Aziz Dabag, of course, the very famous saint, dies, I think, in 1719, if I have my dates correct, and is buried in Fez. One of the frequently glossed over portions of this book is that his encounter with this mysterious Sheikh Abdullah bin Abdul Barnawi. And Barnawi then is this very interesting figure that appears and basically trains him, and eventually says, well, now that I've put you in the presence of witnessing the Prophet Muhammad directly, I can leave you alone, right? And it's incidentally from Abdulaziz Dabagh that through Sheikh Tazi, and then to Sidi Ahmed ibn Idris, that this part of the Shazaliya following Ahmed ibn Idris kind of takes this name of the Tariqa Muhammadiyya. So he also had a sort of reputation of being the Qutb of his age also. But just back to, and so I'm basically making the point here that this Muhammadan Sufism was very much established, even in the aspect of thinking about or preempting the idea of a Tariqa Muhammadiyya a couple of hundred years perhaps before it appeared or proliferated elsewhere in the Muslim world. And now to substantiate the sort of idea that these scholars in Timbuktu were really sort of accentuating this idea of tazkiyah, purification of the self, and making sure that one was trying to influence politics, but keeping a distance from it. You have some of these remarkable testimonies from the Tariq ibn Mukhtar, formerly known as the Tariq Fattash. And they basically suggest then that, as I said previously, some of these towns like Jaba, Jaba is thought to be the origin place for the Jahanke clerical lineage. But there were other towns like this as well that are attested to in these sources, that the Sultan cannot enter it, and anybody who has even killed the son of the Sultan could find refuge there. In one case, this is an instructive example also. There's an Askia Ishaq that comes to Jenne, one of the main centers of culture and Islamic scholarship along the Niger River. Very ancient place of settlement also. But he comes there and says, basically, I'm a just sultan, and I've come here to right the wrongs and punish the wrongdoers of anybody that you've been, whatever you've experienced. Keep in mind that he's coming from Gao, which is another city along the Niger River. So he comes into Jenne, he assembles everybody in the mosque, and he says, I'm here to, right the wrongs and punish the wrongdoers. And everybody is quiet until finally an old man speaks, and it's this Mahmoud Bagayogo, who is a great Soninke scholar also. And finally he says, we know of no one here more tyrannical than you, as you are the source and cause for all that is unjust. For no one here legally seizes wealth by force except you, by your authority and on your orders. If you want to kill the tyrant, begin with yourself and be quick about it. And at this, the Sultan sort of breaks down and says, you're right. And he kind of asks, he repents to God. But then he sort of punishes Mahmud by making him the Qadi of Jenne. And so, and then the text, Qadi Mahmud, then he says, this Sultan has deprived me of sleep and rest by appointing me as Qadi. So I also pray against him that he will die in anxiety and not have any rest the same way he has put me in a place. So there's a sort of discourse then of withdrawal from the corruption of politics, but still being able to speak truth to power. Okay, So I want to move very quickly to this, and I realize I'll need to speed up a little bit. Well, certainly by the 18th century, we have, a variety of articulations coming out of the Qadariya first, but then also in the Tijaniya, and the Tijaniya really is being spread in West Africa, primarily by Umar Futi Tal, who also, like Muhammadan Forio, leads a jihad sparked in his own self-perception as a resistance against injustice and unjust enslavement, but ending in the establishment of a very, very large so-called Islamic state, probably about as big as Western Europe in both cases. So you see there's a sort of testimony then at the foundation of these communities that there's a sort of idea that this tariqa, this Sufi affiliation, or this Sufi community is something you want to be a part of, right? And that the person who's leading this Sufi community has this, incredible spiritual authority. I'll skip over that, but at the same time, there's this, I would say, an increasing accent on the particularities of the Tariqa Muhammadiyya, whereby there's a sort of, I would say, even if the vision of the Prophet had been witnessed before this, it certainly seems to be increasing at the time of this immense political and social turmoil, not only in West Africa, but elsewhere around the Muslim world. And it's no accident then that the foundational acts of these communities, spiritually speaking, we can think about socially and politically what's going on, but spiritually speaking, keep in mind, these are scholars. They're not trained military leaders, right? At a certain time, the Prophet Muhammad, they said, is coming to them in a vision and telling them, go to jihad. Here's the Sayf al-Haq, right? And sheath it against the enemies of God. This was probably not a very comfortable predicament for these scholars to find themselves in. Many of them were advanced in age and were not, as I said, not trained military leaders, not trained in any arts of war. And here they have to now, they feel commanded now to go fight in the jihad, right? And so this is, we find it in most of the jihads that are launched, the larger ones, such as the jihad of Muhammadan Forio and Umar Tal, but also the smaller ones. We also find some sort of continuity with the ways in which these leaders are bringing the visionary experience to also think about a withdrawal from politics. So interesting enough, even though they're profoundly political actors, they're establishing states, they're still sort of recycling this discourse about the best of rulers are those who approach the scholars, and the worst of scholars are those who approach the rulers, right? And that basically one shouldn't be being mired too much in the dunya or in the material world, right? From the Ramah, then, this is the main text of Al-Hajj Umar Futi, and this is probably one of the most outstanding Arabic texts written anywhere in the Muslim world in the 19th century. It's been called that by other scholars besides myself. But one of the interesting chapters within this very voluminous text is the idea of the benefits of the Tijaniya. And we see some aspects of this in the Qadariya around the same time. But I think, what's fascinating about this is that this is really being articulated at the same time that there's a call to a new type of political community, right? In other words, there's an idea that affiliating yourself with this new Sufi community is worth it, right? It's worth it for you to abandon your former lineage affiliation, perhaps if necessary, to convert into a new religion, to to perhaps learn another language, right? To intermarry with people from different ethnic backgrounds, to take up a new occupational caste, or to interact with people that you formerly wouldn't have interacted with, right? And famously then, Elhaj Umar Futi Tall is entrusting formerly enslaved peoples with high offices within his administration, right? And so this is the type of spiritual discourse then that I think pervaded or undergirded this new political call, right? That's this person, you can join this community because you will be a beloved of the Prophet Muhammad. You will die as a saint. You will wear a crown of light, right? You will be able to visit the Prophet Muhammad yourself every day through the practice of the wazifa or the Tijani dhikr or remembrance. So Ahmadu Bamba then is an example of what happens next that I talked about, the withdrawal of the Marabouts under colonial occupation. And you see he's making very clear statements about the giving up of the jihad. Of course, Sufi leaders were hounded at the time by French and British colonial officials for their earlier attachment or their earlier association with the armed jihad against political occupation. So the fact was they simply had to make these types of statements, but they are nonetheless extraordinary, right? And they sort of point to the idea of a return then to this idea of independent scholarly authority. And you sort of see then these are really the same lineages. And in many cases, such as the father of Shaykh Ibrahim Niyas, Al-Hajj Abdullah Niyas, who lives around the same time, he actually is part of the jihad in the early part of his life, and then towards the end of his life, he gives it up. And so you see this transition happening in the late 19th century, where these Sufis are sort of forsaking armed conflict, but concentrating now more on building their independent communities, right? Because now they have space to actually constitute communities in new ways that they couldn't do under the Songhay Empire even, right? Even though there were some communities where the Sultan couldn't go in, fine, but by and large, the sort of large-scale communities and the ability to attract followers from all walks of life was very much circumscribed within the age of empires. But now there's new opportunities for these scholarly communities. And now moving to the kind of 1930s on, these are evidences then from the community of Shaykh Ibrahim Niyas, who's also in Senegal. And from the letters, then you can see very, very clear evidence. He's talking about the French state as an evil. He seems to be associating French colonial officials to locusts. And he's in fact saying by the end of this period, by 1959, that it's actually because of our spiritual work that we're doing that that the jawr, and this when I asked some of the representatives of this movement in Senegal in some field research, they said, yes, our grandfather meant jawr. The jawr was the colonial occupation. So this is an idea then that the spiritual work was the thing that actually ended colonial occupation, nothing else. And so we find this idea then of this is a picture of Shaykh Ibrahim Niyas. This is a community of Sufis that its internal claim was to have 60 million followers by the time of Shaykh Ibrahim's death in 1975. Its current estimates internally, the internal claim is about 100 million. Possible to verify these numbers, but if there's anything close to this, it's truly exceptional, right? This is a larger Muslim movement than the Muslim Brotherhood and perhaps any other Muslim grouping in the contemporary Muslim world, but it's largely escaped scholarly attention because it's based in Black Africa. But you see this kind of continuity of discourse that the true Sufi is the one who follows the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad, salam. And in fact, one time Sheikh Ibrahim is criticized by the Prime Minister of Senegal for being too involved in politics. He famously then, for example, he writes a letter condemning Leopold Senghor for not supporting or giving refuge to Kwame Nkrumah when he was ousted in a coup in 1966. And then the Prime Minister of Senegal at that time, he said, if only Cheikh Ibrahim Niasse had stayed on his prayer rug with his prayer beads and water can for ablutions like the other Sufis, he wouldn't be such of a problem. To which Cheikh Ibrahim responded, if the Prophet Muhammad had stayed on his prayer mat with his prayer beads, then Islam would never have spread around the world. So he himself is sort of thinking about his mission in similar ways. And you can also sort of see that he's talking about this vision of the Prophet as being not only one or two times, but he's always seeing the Prophet, right? And so he's articulating clear ideas then of Africa belonging, kind of like an African nationalism. This was a tract authored in 1960, all in Arabic. And he's saying Africa belongs to the Africans. He's cultivating relationships with people like Amadou Sékou Touré, Kwame Nkrumah, Yakub Gowon from Nigeria, and not only on the basis of a shared Islamic identity, of course, right? And is basically thinking about a vision of Pan-Africanism from an Islamic perspective. According to Usman Khan, who did more work on the colonial archives than I have, he says that the file for Cheikh Ibrahim Niasse is probably the most voluminous of any other Muslim leader in West Africa. And one attestation that I translated says, the traditional nature of Wani Ibrahim Niasse should not allow his activities to escape our attention. Neither can we ignore that his spiritual enterprise is especially assured in the Hausa regions of the Gold Coast and northern Nigeria, where there is a risk of seeing the impending creation of a state for the Black race with a Muslim political and social structure. So there's, clearly there's an ability or perceived ability for Cheikh Ibrahim to kind of articulate this Muslim identity very broadly appealing. There's accounts of thousands of people converting to Islam in Ghana at one time after him giving a speech and elsewhere in the world as well. He also has close relations with people like Gamal Abdel Nasser, but also with the King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And he goes to Pakistan, even to China. And he says, I have traveled east and west to show the right way. My wish is for the triumph of Islam, and I have refused war. My only desire is to guide the Muslim community toward the merciful God. You will not find someone who loves Muslims more than I. And one time I was interviewing Sheikh Hassan Sisi, who is the grandson. He died in 2008, but he was the grandson of Cheikh Ibrahim Niasse and the imam of the community. And he said, one time I was with Cheikh Ibrahim in Libya, and an Arab man came that was very wealthy and known to be supporting anti-colonial revolutions around the world. And he said, Cheikh Ibrahim, I know what you're doing, and I'm prepared to fund a revolution in Senegal. I have 20,000 troops, and we'll install you as the emir of an Islamic state in Senegal. And he said, Sheikh Hassan said, Cheikh Ibrahim turned to me and said in Wolof, this man does not understand my mission, right? So there is this continuity of sort of backing away from overt political manipulation, perhaps, and staying faithful to this kind of withdrawal from or separation from politics, influence over politics, yes, but not taking direct political control. He does also, and of course, the idea of an Islamic state probably would not have been amenable to him, not because of the idea of Islam, but because probably of the idea of the state and the idea that if one is living in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic environment, that state then has to be based upon mutual consultation. And that was his sort of idea, right? That you had your separate huts, your separate homes, but then you would come, like the world as one small village, you would come to discuss your affairs in the center of the village and then raise your children the way you felt necessary. And here he's talking very explicitly about the need for mutual consultation. He also was very, in this embrace of other Muslims around the world and other, especially in relationships with Arabs. At one time in Egypt, at the height of Arab nationalism, he gets on, he's given the microphone to speak on TV, and he says, yes, Arab nationalism is great, but I remind Gamal Abdel Nasser that the Arab people extend from Indonesia to Ghana. And it's anywhere, basically we're not interested in a racialist understanding of solidarity. And we don't have anything to bring us together except for Islam. Within this idea, then, he's essentially saying that Arabs have no particular claim to leadership over the Muslim world. And if you read this closely, you can essentially understand that he's making himself a claim that Black Africans, in some cases, can and should be the spiritual leaders of the Muslim world. And to kind of give you that evidence, he's saying in a number of different places, that whoever loves the Prophet, ﷺ, the most, that's the person who's deserves the leadership or gets preeminence. And he himself is saying, I became distinguished among centuries for the sake of the Prophet. The might of the servant is the might of its master. Thus has the universe been subdued at the hand of the deputized servant, Abdul Musawwad. And so in Arabic, there was a very influential Facebook post at one point that mistranslated this as saying, the universe has been subdued at the hand of the Black servant. And you can see, if you know Arabic, there's a sort of an easy way in which this is misunderstood, because aswad is the same root as siyada, or could look as the same root as siyada here, meaning so one is leadership and one is being blackened. But if you know Arabic, this does not actually mean the Black servant. But nonetheless, I think that the meaning was sort of close enough that people understood that, in fact, Shaykh Ibrahim Niasse is making probably one of the most unambiguous claims to ultimate spiritual authority, according to the discourses of the Sufis, that has ever really been made in writing. I don't think, I could go on and on. There's very, very clear statements in this effect when he's saying, I'm not saying this out of boasting, I'm not saying this out of spiritual intoxication, but I am the Qutb of the time, right? I am the axial saint of the time. And the fact that he's, in part of his magnum opus, The Removal of Confusion, Kashf al-Ilbas, he's actually articulating very clearly that he has a whole chapter in the appendix that says it's about racial discrimination on the spiritual path. And he's essentially saying in that this idea that only Arabs or that only a descendant of the Prophet could be the actual saint of the time is erroneous. And so just to conclude then, and thank you for your patience, he is also, I sort of laid out in the beginning this idea that this was a sort of vibrant, engaged Sufism that promised to kind of give followers an alternative vision of modernity. This is some of my evidence for saying that basically to be a beloved of God through following the prophet allows one to be a vehicle of God, an instrument of God in the creation. And this is a paraphrase of a longer hadith. When I love him, God says, I become him. When I love my servant, I become him. Or in the longer narration, it says, I become the hand with which he strikes, the foot through which he walks, the ear through which he hears, etc., the eye through which he sees. And were he to ask of me, I would surely grant it to him. So there's this idea of this extraordinary capacity, extraordinary potentiality of the human condition that's open for all through this experience of loving God and obtaining his knowledge. And after all this, the movement of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse was really primarily based upon the idea of spreading knowledge, the knowledge of God on a mass scale. And then he says more explicitly, what can occur through the path of worshipful servitude and righteousness is many times greater than what has become apparent today by the path of scientific discovery. Right? So he's essentially saying that, you will not be left behind through this experience of knowing God, that all things will be subjected to you. Okay, I'm going to end there, and I'm basically, just to conclude, I'm essentially saying that there are remarkable continuities and remarkable adaptations of this kind of spiritual disposition of Muhammadan Sufism from the earliest record of Muslim identity in West Africa into the present time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting talk. It's very exciting. I would hand over to Prof. Makoni to begin the question and answers with you.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Wright. I want to start off with a flippant question, then I'll move on to a more serious one. Since you are in Qatari at the moment, is there a Sufi orientation to football or sport?
Sure, but I'll give you the tafsir. So I heard from Sheikh, I was watching the TV one day with Sheikh Hassan Sisi in Senegal, and there's a football soccer player on, and he said, Sheikh Ibrahim, my grandfather, he said that all of the previous revelations are contained in the Quran. And all of the Quran is contained in the first chapter, the Fatiha al-Kitab. And all of the first chapter of Quran is contained in the phrase, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, which means Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And all of that is contained in the dot underneath the ba, Arabic. And he said, and the ba is like the ball. And this is why you see people chasing around the ball. He said, and one day you will see wars fought over this game. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me quote you from one of the papers that that you sent, and I must say I liked that quotation very much, and I think you talked about it, but I would like to perhaps get you to reframe it for me. This is from your article called Islam, Blackness and African Cultural Distinction, the Islamic Negritude of Sharia Ibrahim Niasse. My first question to you is this, first of all, is when I read this, in what way is Islamic negritude different or similar or different from Leopold Sédar Senghor's negritude? Because by calling it here Islamic, but I remember in the paper you put in quotes Islamic negritude. So I was trying to work out how does this differ or compare with the negritude that we associate with Leopold Sédar Senghor.
Yeah, so I must admit that my reading of Senghor's Negritude is probably profoundly spiritual, having been influenced by my dear mentor, Suleiman Bashir Jang, who reads Senghor's Negritude as a sort of spiritual disposition at the end. Like if you actually follow it down, and he's essentially saying that, in fact, Senghor is using the category of race to actually argue against racialization. And so then with that sort of reading, a type of spiritual disposition of human capacity, right? But also sort of drawing upon different historic. So in this letter that I interrogate from Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse to Senghor, I essentially say that Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse is kind of invoking this idea of the unique contributions to humanity of the Black people as a result of our history. To say that Sheikh Ibrahim's vision of African cultural distinction was kind of an idea of that one shaped by history, that's more similar in the ways in which it's sort of commonly understood to Aimé Césaire's understanding of negritude, which is a historical shaping, not a sort of inherent racialism. But nonetheless, when I sort of think about the idea of the human capacity to become the instrument of God, and I'm using that instrument in a very specific way, because I think when you look at Senghor's vision of art, and particularly music, then you understand this idea of African contribution to humanity as becoming an instrument of the rhythm, right? To become a rhythmic force in the world. And I see that as actually very similar to what Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse is saying about the potentiality of the human being to become the instrument of God. Okay, good. Thanks a lot. So let me continue with this. Then you may help me clarify some of these issues for myself. As I was going through this article and then listening to you, I was asking myself whether you are arguing that within Islam, there are issues about Black racial consciousness, even though there may be limited interaction between the Blacks and the whites. Let me backtrack a little bit. The tendency of scholarship coming from, let's say, the United States, Canada, etc., and all that, is to give the impression that issues about race are confined to these geographical regions. But when I was reading your work, the issue about Black racial identities, etc., I then came to the conclusion that you are arguing to some extent about the centrality of Blackness in Islamic identity. Am I right, or I'm completely? Yeah, I would say that, you know, there is a conversation around color, right? I mean, I would just sort of suggest that color. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That it's not the same kind of racialization that's happening in the West. Yes. As long as we recognize that and we speak to it on its own terms, and we recognize that, yes, Ibn Khaldun said some disparaging things about Black people. He also said disparaging things about, you know, white Europeans. And we also have scholars before him, Jihads, for example, that are arguing as early as the 8th and 9th century for the superiority of Black people over white people. So as long as we can recognize that this is a fundamentally different terrain, then we can also sort of recognize that they're very interesting conversations about Blackness. And so one of the very interesting issues it's a small issue, but one of translation, is that, John Hunwick was, I very much respect this figure, one of the great figures of the scholarship of Islam in Africa, had previously translated a hadith, a statement of the Prophet that is related by Ahmed Baba and the scholars of Timbuktu to say, Atakhadhu Sudan, or Ahl Sudan, right? So basically he's translating it as take care or look after the Blacks, because among them are three lords of paradise, right? Najashi, the king of Ethiopia, Luqman, the wise, and Bilal, the muadhin. But in Arabic, the actual meaning, atakhudhu, means to affect the ways, right? In other words, become like them. So this drastically changes the meaning. One, from a sort of an idea of patronizing, like paternalism, right? Whites looking after Blacks. And another, to take these people as your exemplars, right? So that's a type of an understanding that I think there's ways in which we as an academic community have fundamentally misread or racialized discussions around color in the Muslim world. I'm not saying that they're not there, but we have to approach them on their own terms. And also historically, right? We also have to recognize that colonial types of racialization, or even the imposition of plantation racial capitalism in the Muslim world and around the world, frankly, prior to colonialism, also racialized, did funny things to the ways in which race was constructed. So we have to historicize this conversation also and get away from kind of the idea of the, I think what I'm sort of responding to is this sort of
yes, I see what you mean.
idea of kind of Arab slaver over
For example, in your article, you mentioned something that is very interesting, which I think underscores the importance of understanding the historical context and how these notions of race are constantly being reconfigured. You say it somewhere. Whiteness in some context was repositioned as a marker of European infidelity, with Blacks and Black Africans closer to salvation. It's more or less like you're turning everything completely upside down in a sense, and it's closer to the sort of issues about Black consciousness. But anyway, this I thought was quite interesting. Now let me take you to what I think is the most memorable statement you made today and in your writing, which I will use in the next paper that I write as the opening statement. It is this, let me read it in full. It says that the Muslim community of the Senegalese Shia near 1900 to 1975, with tens of millions of adherents, mostly in West Africa, was one of the largest religious networks of the latter 20th century, both on the African continent and in the Muslim world. But outside of the field of African Muslim, the movement has received only passing mention in Islamic studies, and its engagement with discourses of African decolonization is hardly appreciated in studies of African nationalism. That is the phrase that I thought I liked quite a lot, because I think it aptly captures the blind spots in most of the studies on decolonization, that you hardly have studies that look into the Islamic engagement with discourses of decolonization. Now, my specific question is this. Assuming I bumped into you and I'm rushing to go to a lecture, and I say, can you just give me in 2-3 minutes what that Islamic engagement with discourses of decolonization would be like? Just sort of summarize so that I can go and repeat it to my undergraduate students.
Yeah. All right. Well, one, I would say a longstanding and uncompromising disposition towards liberation and self-determination. And secondly, I would say an embrace of global South solidarities in a very practical way. So even while, you have people trained in the mission schools, Western educated elites that are writing treatises about Pan-Africanism, movements like those of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse are doing the thing on the ground that the people like Kwame Nkrumah can only dream of, right? They are establishing networks that transcend ethnic divisions, linguistic divisions, caste divisions, intermarrying Hausa with Wolof, trading partnerships. And so it's like the states are not actually catching up to them. So Sheikh Ibrahim at one point, he says, if not for the boundaries imposed by colonial occupation, I could have united all of Africa under the banner of La ilaha illallah, of there is no God but God, right?
Yeah, thanks a lot, thanks. Yeah, let me give over to Edwin. I still have a couple of more questions that will come up as we go along. Edwin, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thank you so much. Khadija has her hand raised. Khadija, you can ask your question.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to attend today, and I was so surprised to see this subject because, I came from Senegal, and I aware of all of this. I really grew up into it. Like, I'm a part of a Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba movement, but I know a lot of people who are so into Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, and your work, it's incredible because you say at the beginning, you talk about Sufism in Mali, and today I don't really feel like in Mali they always apply Sufism, they maybe it's because of the presence of some terrorists over there. Islam had changed a lot through the time, but in Senegal, it's really a part of our lives. All the tariqa just so linked with political, economical, social, and moral life in Senegal. We just can't go without it. You talk about Senghor. For me, like Souleymane Bachir Diagne is really the one that really understand what Senghor wanted to say. Because like in Senegal, most of the time, we just see Senghor as someone who wanted to be someone who wanted to be just a white person, and we don't really understand his spiritual dimension. We always thought like, yes, he make easy for colonization. He just so linked with France, and Souleymane Bachir Diagne just came and said, no, it was not here. You were just judging him wrong, and I'm here to explain. So it was interesting to see it in that way. And previously, Mr. Makoni talked about, he said something how the self-conscious Blackness, but for the Murid, for Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, this self-consciousness just start with linguistic, because for like the Tijaniya, because in Senegal, we have the Tijaniya with Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, the Tijaniya with Omar Foutiyou Tall, the Tijaniya with Serigne Cheikh, like it's a lot of branch, but in Mouridism, we just have one way. And in this way, we just refuse to speak French. We will just acknowledge like going to school. We will acknowledge like learning French, because we will just see like French is bad, so we just talk Arabic and Wolof, and that's it. Instead of Tijaniya, they can go abroad, they can speak English, they can speak everything, but they always go back to Islam. Sometimes when I compare the two, I say like they are more open, because they will think like, yeah, we can go to take something from the colonization and maybe learn about it. Is nothing like, is nothing bad in speaking English. Like Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse like died in London. He go abroad Nigeria and make all the Hausa and Nigerian people becoming Muslim. Every year, like he had a big magal, I don't know how to say it in English, but like more than 2 million of people just came from around the world to celebrate him. And sometimes I just say, maybe if he was just in Senegal saying like, no, I don't want to speak French, I don't want to speak English, maybe he will not have these big, people that big knowing him. So that was my point. I don't know if you get it. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, Sofnasi. Khadija moy.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Khadija moy tor sama dom jigen tamit.
Oh, da ngay lak wolof, dégg nga.
Yeah, no, I did tell her my Khadija is also the name of my daughter. Yeah, I think, you know, Senegal, of course, is somewhat distinctive, and I'm always sort of careful to extrapolate my research, which has primarily been in Senegal. I've also done some research in Nigeria, Ghana, and Mauritania, Ivory Coast, and Morocco. But primarily, I think I've lived about 3 years in Senegal altogether. And of course, Senegal has a distinction of being like the most Sufi country in the world, right? According to the Research Center, which says that 93% of all Muslims in Senegal are definitely associated with some sort of Sufi order or another. Yeah, so I think the distinctions between the Mouridiyya and the Tijaniyya, as least taught by Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, are sometimes more historically contextual than other things. So I think that you know, Sheikh Ibrahim was sort of at a later generation. He missed the opportunity. His community sort of missed the opportunity to kind of you know, that the Touba community with the Tiwawan community and the community of Seydou Nourou Tall really sat down at the table with the colonial officials and basically divided up Senegal in terms of their different spheres of influence. And in fact, the French government actively tried to contain the spread of Sheikh Ibrahim's Faida in Kaolack, Senegal, and actually brought in, you know, Tiwawan communities, Touba community, Mourid communities around the outskirts of Medina Bay to try to make sure that it didn't kind of expand. And so Sheikh Ibrahim basically expanded internationally, and that's something that the colonial officials didn't expect. But yeah, so I think, you know, Sheikh Ibrahim, one of the things that I try to do in my work is to demonstrate the interchanges between Sufi communities within Senegal and elsewhere around West Africa, because sometimes when you're studying in these communities, you don't understand that. Like, you understand that they're almost, it's in sort of isolation, but in fact, like, Sheikh Ibrahim was really good friends with Mbake Busso, one of the great scholars of Touba. He read Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba's work and quoted him. And so there's a story that after his death, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba came to Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse and said, "You are my Khalifa." And he says, "Well, you know, I don't need that. I'm a Tijani, you know." But so I told that to one Murid, a friend of mine, and he said, okay, he refused the Khalifa of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, but Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba gave it to him anyway. And so anyway, so there's this kind of I think there's more similarities than differences. And many of these positionalities, I think, are not so much tariqa based or based upon Sufi orders. They're often, you know, there's for example, here in Qatar, there are many, I know there's Murid and Tijani Senegalese, you know, studying Arabic and saying, you know, interacting and sharing more than, so when there's a Mawlid, for example, they come together as they do in America, as you know. But yes, Sheikh Ibrahim famously said, you know, if you travel and you don't know Arabic and French or Arabic and English, you may well have stayed home because you will learn nothing. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Michael Scott has a question, but he indicates that the question has been answered to some extent, but I would still read it if you have any further comments. So he prefaces by saying, thank you for a very interesting and informative presentation. He's wondering if there are examples of what you mentioned of the Sufi orders, that is cursing of colonial powers, that have been preserved and or available in written form. Or are they now part of an oral tradition of sermons, anecdotes, and storytelling? Are scholars today engaged in studying this, perhaps embryonic decolonial corpus, if it is accessible? And if so, from the perspective of which disciplines? Is this tradition of invective more political or theological in nature? Do these examples directly address the colonists themselves, or are they aimed at the Sufi order burden? Yeah, there's a series of questions.
Just to an extent. Yes, thank you, Professor Scott, for this interesting conversation. I think that like a full intellectual history of prayer as the weapon of the believer, right? This is the famous hadith where the Prophet says, Dua salah al-mu'min, right? That the prayers, that the dua, the supplication is the weapon of the believer. I think a full multi-century history of this could be done. And what I'm working with now partially is the Bustan al-Fuwaid al-Muhammad al-Qabri, yes, probably written in 1450. And this is replete. This is about a 71-page manuscript, at least in the version that we have at the Northwestern Library. And it's replete with examples of ways to destroy sultans, unjust tyrants, and cause them all sorts where you can shut their mouths, you can kill them, you can make them impotent, all sorts of things. And so what's interesting about this is that many of these sultans were probably Muslim, at least in name. So it's not precisely, I mean, it's a sort of, I think the way that Sheikh Ibrahim would talk about it is, and this sort of pervades his work also, it's a fight against injustice. It's not a fight against, the French or the or the non-believers per se. It's a fight against people that are acting unjustly. And in fact, at one point he says, political authority is sustained, God sustains political authority over time on the basis of justice, not on the basis of belief. And he says, a believer can live for a long time in a place of no faith, but he cannot last long in a place of no justice. So that the prayerful exertions primarily in the West African textual corpus, which dates very, very old, is primarily directed against injustice. And I think, I've found in the writing of Sayyidi Ali Sisi, who is the Khalifa of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, and the Imam after him, places where he quotes directly from this 15th century Timbuktu text, the Bustan al-Fuwaid, right? So I think there is a very, very long discourse about prayer as the weapon of the believer, but of course it takes various forms. I mean, I think one of the things that Sheikh Ibrahim is doing is a sort of a turn towards a more supplicatory war against injustice. Also through, like, he'll say, get together and recite Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel, which is basically means sufficient for me is God, the best of trustees. Recite that 12,000 times. Allegedly, that was the prayer by which Prophet Abraham got out of the fire of Nimrod, through knowing that phrase. And but if you look at Muqabbari's text, there are things that like, okay, write the verse al-hakam takathur, which is like, a verse of the Quran, and then but write it in the milk of a dog, right? And then put the name of the sultan you want to destroy. So that's a different type of spiritual warfare that's going on, which I'm not saying is not still practiced. It is. It is still practiced in West Africa, but I'm just saying that there's a variety of different ways that you can look at this spiritual warfare against injustice. One through the kind of realm of talismans and occultism, if you wish. One towards a more kind of communal effort of remembrance that I think is. So anyway, I think is a very, very interesting category of inquiry, not inquisition. Sorry.
Shukran jazilan. That's very nice, ya Doctor. Shukran. Thank you. That's great. Very helpful. Appreciate it. Thank you.
If there are any other, yeah, Anissa. Anissa, you are muted.
Thank you very much, Professor Wright, for this extremely illuminating conversation. I'm wondering if you can throw some light on what is the response of the Sufis in Africa to the growth, I almost feel, of the Salafis.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say there's a lively, in the text of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, going back to the late 1950s and early 1960s, there is a lively response to this. And I think this is important because oftentimes Sufis are often positioned in the literature as being kind of incapable of responding to the rational arguments of the Salafis. But he's pretty adept at it, and in his own from his own perspective. And the issue is really a theological one, and I've tried to write about this earlier when I had an article called Islamic Orthodoxy in Salafi theology in West Africa or something like that. But it's basically about the ways in that this is not really coming down to an argument about Sufism per se. Of course, for the Salafis, it's often positioned as such, that these people are grave worshippers and they're mushrikun, they're idolaters. From the perspective of the traditionally trained scholars who are practicing Sufism, but also the other objects of censure by the Salafi discourse, which include the madhahib, the schools of Islamic law, and the traditional schools of theology, they are essentially repositioning this as a theological issue. And it's most famously, I think for me, it's most succinctly argued by one of the shurafa I met in Fez. And he said, we don't, what did he say? He said, yes, we have a problem. I was asking him about his perspective on different sectarian divides in the Muslim world. He said, yes, we have a problem with the Shia. The Shia have insulted some of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. So he said, but our main problem is with these Salafi people, because they believe that God sits in a chair in the sky, and that's blasphemy. Right? So this was reframed then as a theological issue. And from this perspective, then the Salafis kind of look even more ridiculous than the Sufis look in the Salafi discourse, right? Because they're basically completely unaware of the fundamentals of Islamic theology. So I would just say that they are capable of responding. They're not being completely outflanked. There's also an understanding from a West African perspective that that this is an imposition from outside. It's an external imposition. And when I was with Sheikh Hassan Sisi in the aftermath of 9/11, he said, I've been called by the American ambassador to talk about the Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but he said, I tell them the first time we hear of Osama bin Laden is from you people. So but but you know, at the same time, I think with the scholars of West Africa, there's a, and so Usman Khan has this article called or this conversation about Islamism in West Africa. And he says, if you look into Islamism, then actually Sufis are not really opposed to the idea, right? They're not completely opposed to the idea that Islam should have an influence over politics. They have some disagreement about the details. So you do find in the Mustarshideen movement, for example, in Senegal, that there is some overlap between Salafism and some kind of reformist Sufism going on in West Africa. And one time I was traveling in Fouta Toro, the north of Senegal, and I was traveling with a person from Tiwan, the Tiwawan community, and another person who had been trained in some of the Salafi schools. And our job was to go around Fouta Toro and to catalog the manuscript tradition of some of the old teaching lineages. And after a while, the Sufi says to me, you know, what's interesting is that he's not like the Salafis I've met outside of Senegal. He has adab, you know, like he has good manner. In other words, because of the pervasiveness of the Sufi tradition and traditional learning practices in West Africa, even the Salafis have good manners in Senegal. That was his joke.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So it seems, any other questions?
Right. Let me ask another question and see. I should know this from your presentation, but what are the parameters or the key elements of this alternative modernity which Sufism is trying to buy into? Right. What would be the key parameters of an alternative modernity that Sufism might be interested in, or that Sufism subscribes to?
Right. So that's a good question. I mean, I'm not really completely comfortable with the idea of an alternative, you know.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Modernity, but I mean, I've used it. So, and I'm essentially sort of drawing upon. All right, so I was a student academically of Rudolf Ware and Jonathan Glassman, both of whom were students of Steve Fireman at University of Pennsylvania. And he famously argued as a historian, you know, that you have to sort of take seriously the meta-narratives of non-Western people and not just position their story as an addendum or as a micro-history that serves to overall reinforce the meta-narrative of the West, right? So I do think it's important to kind of think about what does the kind of long-term historical identity of West African Muslims look like? What is their positionality, their role from their own perspective as historical agents into the future, from the present into the future, right? And so this is where I would say, you know, the statements of the Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, for example, in poetry, but it's not the only example that one could draw upon, but where he's basically saying, we are a community of a unique historical positionality, right? He says, "Awjadani haqqan bi jabal kasri fa innani wakilu sirru sirri," right? He said, I have been created to heal the fracture, right? And I asked Sheikh Hassan, what does he mean here? And he says, it's the fracture. He said, in the modern times, there's a fracture that is a gulf that's developed between humanity and their creator, right? And so in this time of intense materialism and of alienation of human beings from their divine purpose, then the faida, the flood of divine knowledge, comes to ameliorate, to allow for people to get to know their creator on an unprecedented scale, right? So that's what the meta-narrative kind of looks like from within.
Mhm.
And whether that's an alternative modernity or not, I mean, I think there are ways in which, practically speaking, the community of Cheikh Ibrahim Niasse and other traditionally based communities in Senegal and elsewhere in West Africa do not feel themselves outflanked by modernity. So take, for example, the pedagogically speaking, right? The classical way of learning was that you sat with your teacher in a more or less one-to-one relationship under a tree outside the mosque and you memorized the text, right? Now, within the context of colonialism, that sort of habitus is still very much internalized, the idea of embodied knowledge, the idea of learning as an internalization. But at the same time, Cheikh Ibrahim Niasse then famously kind of started the madrasa system in Medina Bay, right, where he brought the reformed modern version of the Azhari curriculum into Senegal, and then established a relationship with Gamal Abdel Nasser and others, whereby people were going to study at Azhar and come back, and later on other communities followed a similar example, to my understanding. I could be wrong, but so this was part of a general then procedure by which earlier learning practices and dispositions were preserved even as people adapted to new systems. And he famously said, if it's just about Islam, I will teach you Islam. But these days you need a diploma, so go to the school, right? And in my own field research, I witnessed a sort of graduation ceremony in Medina Bay at one of these schools. And all of the sheikhs of the community assembled. The person who graduated was given their diploma, but then the real test came, right? Then some of the sheikhs would now kind of take turns reciting a few lines of Arabic poetry. And the person who had just graduated, in order to sort of demonstrate their scholarly expertise in front of the community, now would have to extemporaneously compose in his head a few new lines of poetry that rhymed with the first lines that they were given and explain the original verses. Like, this was an amazing feat, right, of scholarly extemporaneous. The idea in Arabic, we say, kif haythu waqafu thumma sir, right? Get to where they got to, then proceed. In other words, your memorization and your internalization of the previous tradition is not to simply regurgitate it, it's to improvise into the present, like a jazz musician does, right? And so this was then, I think what's going on, this capacity then to embrace, to sort of say, yes, these new fields of scholarly knowledge, we can obtain them, we can integrate them into what we know, but at the same time, we're not going to give up our practices that we have had for centuries.
Let me ask you, thank you very much. Let me ask you a question I should have asked at the very beginning. When you get to Senegal and you are carrying out your research, methodologically, how do you go about it? Let me give you a bigger context. There's a course that I'll be teaching on African methodologies, etc., next semester. So if I want to use your work, and one of the key questions that I would ask my students is, methodologically, how did Zachary go about either in quotes, collecting his data, analyzing it? How do you go about carrying out your research when you are in Senegal?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in my 2015 book, Living Knowledge in West African Islam, I do lay that out a little bit.
Okay.
So I'm basically conceiving myself as part of a generation of scholars of Islam in Africa that tried to move away from narrating about Muslim communities in Africa from the colonial archive.
Okay.
And it's not that I completely ignore the archive, but I feel it's important to understand, and I mean, this is the adage of religious studies in general. You have to articulate religious identities in terms that make sense to the practitioners themselves. So I I'm very clear that I'm just one perspective of many. I'm not trying to give the definitive history of any community or any or make any sort of authoritative claims. I'm very clear from the beginning that I'm a Muslim, and that perhaps allows me to narrate identities from the inside in different ways, but it doesn't mean that my narrative shouldn't be read in dialogue with other narratives produced from other perspectives. I'm simply making the claim that there is no sort of there is no sort of false sense of objectivity that one can acquire simply by saying I'm a non-believer, right? And I often find the confessional gymnastics of so-called atheists in their work to be sort of off-putting, right? I mean, and so they basically make this whole claim about how I can talk about these in a sort of unprecedented way because I'm outside of the tradition. Well, that doesn't give you any sort of better account. Matter of fact, it can give it gives you a different account, but it's not better or worse. So I don't make any sort of apologies for thinking about a narrative from within. I think that's important. I don't claim that it's the only narrative to be read, but so that's kind of my methodology.
What is the title of your book that you are referring to? The one where you lay out methodology?
So that's Living Knowledge in West African Islam, the Sufi community.
Living Knowledge. Okay, thank you.
I would just add a short addendum to that, and that's I would say one of the things that I've methodologically kind of discovered is the importance of a very old science in the Islamic tradition called Ilm al-Rijal, which is basically inherited from Hadith studies, which essentially thinks about oral ethnography as being very important to pay attention to the character of the person you're talking to, right? So whatever it is, the moral kind of scheme by which you're evaluating who's talking, that's extremely important, right? And that needs to be clear from the beginning. What kind of standards you are thinking about, right? So for as many of you know, when you show up to do field research, people are going to be coming to you from all sorts of walks of life, right? It's important to kind of sift through the information you're getting. What is the agenda of the person that's talking? Are they aware of what you're doing, right? And so that kind of paying attention to the kind of character. And so what happens, of course, in a scholarly community is that if you're seen as a person that's taking knowledge from every Fulan bin Fulan, right, or every person, then the scholars themselves are not going to want to talk to you, right? So I've been clear that look, I have a very close relationship with certain scholarly lineages within Medina Bay, right, in the community of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. And so that makes my account perhaps not as broad-based as others, right? And so I just feel like it's important to be forthcoming about who you are as a person when you're doing the research and who you're connected to, right? And who feels themselves represented in your work more than others. So I think as long as we can all be very honest about who we are, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Edwin, there's somebody I think was got a question in the chat.
Yeah. Vishna had wanted to announce the next speaker.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. That's fine.
She announces it, I can ask.
Yeah, then yeah.
Okay, so thank you all for joining the formal part of our session. I'm going to announce